I just want to talk a little bit about knowledge. I've been watching quite a few YouTube videos lately about knowledge and about scientific knowledge and dogmatism and those kind of things. Professor Anton made a couple of videos in this area. Thomas Mattis, I was looking at one of his yesterday. And it's an area that's of great interest to me as well. I think that from my perspective at least, there's a couple of things about knowledge which I have some problems with, or I think which the whole idea of knowledge generates, really. I think it generates problems. I mean, the first thing is to do with knowledge as a kind of category of cognitive experience, if I can call it that. A kind of cognitive entity that we call knowledge. Distinct from other cognitive entities, like fantasy, or hope, or desire, or hypothesis, or dream, or fiction in all the various shades of meaning that could have, or fear, or guess. Now, there's a whole series of, and that's just a small section I suspect, there's a whole series of kind of cognitive entities, if I can call them that, which are distinct from knowledge, or could be distinct from knowledge, and which have got very different kinds of, well, different kind of value, I think, or are valued in different ways, and to the extent that they're valued at all. And one of the difficulties that I have with that, or that I've seemed to run against, is that a lot of those cognitive entities I've just spoken about are undervalued, or are placed within a kind of value hierarchy in which this entity called knowledge is at the top. So if you put knowledge as against fantasy, or knowledge as against belief, or knowledge as against hypothesis, or knowledge as against dream, knowledge has a very, very particular status. And I think it's a kind of power status driven from by social life, really, but which is fine. But it definitely seems to me that it does have that status. And to that extent, I think it's probably the canal boat coming, so I'm going to just be quiet for this minute while this boat goes past, otherwise I won't be able to hear a thing. Taliesin. Okay, so I suppose what I'm arguing there, and I think Aristotle says something similar actually, is that, and much better of course, is that the various entities, cognitive entities that exist, one of which is knowledge, and that is accorded a particular status and value with the rest of those things, not being given different but equal values, but being given either different but lesser values, or measured on the same scale of values and found wanting. And corresponding to that, I think, there is a kind of an aspiration on the part of other cognitive entities, on how we treat other cognitive entities. There's an aspiration to give them the quality of knowledge. There's a quotation from Walter Pater where he says something like, all art aspires to the condition of music. And I think, just to paraphrase that, I think there's a way of thinking that all cognition aspires to the condition of knowledge, certainly within a social context. If I'm confronted with someone who has what might be called archetypical knowledge, something like a set of empirical data, for example, and I come there with a belief, then I'm not going to do very well, quite honestly. I'm going to fail in any kind of comparison, unless I can convince the person I'm speaking to that my belief has the status of knowledge. And so my belief aspires to that status, my fantasy might aspire to that status, in order to compete in the marketplace of ideas, particularly the marketplace of hard knowledge. So that, I think, is the first kind of problem with knowledge that I have, is that all the other forms of, and including things like wisdom, actually, which I've spoken about before, and things like enlightenment, which I'm really, really vague on, I have to say, but it seems to exist as an entity in the world, in the world of cognition and thought, so I can't ignore that. But I do think it's different to knowledge, or it's more usefully thought of as being different to knowledge, and then assigned a set of values which are not the same values as knowledge. And just as a side issue here, when I'm talking about knowledge, and the reason why I'm kind of aligning knowledge with empiricism, I'm really coming out of ideas like Jacques Rancière's Poetics of Knowledge, or about or kind of Stanley Fish talking about ordinary language as opposed to poetic language, in which empirical knowledge is a very, very particular, well, some would say a language game, but some would say a very particular orientation of experience, which allows that experience to perform in certain ways and make certain kinds of claims. And that is, I think, is different to the kinds of claims and the kind of functioning that things like fantasy and wonder and belief and all those other things I've spoken about, all those things act and perform. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is in relation to this aspiration. To the extent that cognitive processes aspire to the condition of knowledge, I think we do find that, and I certainly find that a lot in the reading that I do, to do with people talk about different ways of knowing, or different approaches to knowledge, or different kinds of knowledge, and give these names sometimes. So we talk about occult knowledge, or we talk about embodied knowledge, or sensual knowledge, or first-person knowledge, or situated knowledge, or subjective knowledge. There's a whole, or religious knowledge. There's a whole series of hedges, if you like, of different kind of precursors to the knowledge word, which I think mark that aspiration, mark the attempt by a particular kind of cognitive process to make that aspirational leap into the domain of knowledge, or to the status of knowledge, which, as I said, is considered hierarchically superior and more valuable in particular ways. But I think that's doomed to failure as well, actually. I think the whole idea of different ways of knowing, and then qualifying these different ways of knowing by terms like situated or occult or embodied and those kind of things, is doomed to failure. And the reason why I think it's doomed to failure is because, in a sense, we're buying into the same metaphor of what knowledge is. And this is something I've spoken about before. But I think when we talk about in those terms, we're imagining knowledge in a very particular way. And I think it's an accurate way. I think it works well in cognitive terms. But I think we're buying into a metaphor that knowledge exists kind of, well, archetypically at least, or prototypically, exists as a series of kind of objects, existing in a kind of metaphorical, hypothetical, interpersonal space out there in the world. And you find that almost literally, but it is metaphorically, but it's almost literally, in ideas like David Perkins' idea of possessive knowledge. These are hard facts. Listen to those words, hard facts. Things you can hold in your hand and hold up to the light and show other people. You find it in Polanyi's idea of explicit knowledge, in which the knowledge is kind of unrolled out into the world like a manuscript, and there it is at the end of the manuscript, explicit. And you find it in pretty much all kinds of knowledge paradigms, really. There's always this idea of a certain kind of knowledge, the most valuable empirical knowledge, the empirical knowledge that Rancière talks about, as being spoken about as if it was a series of objects. Even the word itself, knowledge, it's a noun. And Rondel Langacker talks about nouns as objects. So when we're talking about objects and we're talking about knowledge, we are tacitly, I beg your pardon, metaphorically making those kind of claims. And within that framework, any other kind of knowledge, other than the knowledge which is possessive, which is held up to the light, the bright light of day, and is interpersonally available, any other kind of knowledge is going to fall short. And so the aspiration is always going to be underachieved. So when we talk about situated knowledge, we're still making these aspirational claims, but we're saying, actually, you can only see it if you stand in this particular place, in this particular situation. If you're talking about embodied knowledge, you're pretty much saying, yes, it's knowledge that exists as an object, but you have to be in my body to be able to experience it. If you're talking about occult knowledge, then you're saying, yes, there's knowledge, but there's a shadow falling across it. It's a little bit hidden. And I think the origins of the word occult lie in this idea of being shadowed, and only some of us can see it who can peer into those shadows. So I think all of those qualifiers basically occupy the same metaphorical landscape, but they hedge the availability of that knowledge in a way which is inevitably going to make it less valuable in the terms in which we're thinking about it. So that aspiration is always going to fall short. Okay, I'm not really sure